Gentlemen, welcome to the last day of the DSC Jaipur Literature Festival. You're here at the Councilage Darbar Hall, and we have a first session today, Saving Face, with Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy, who's in conversation with Shoma Chaudhury. I request everyone to make sure that there's no flash photography while the session's going on, and please switch off your cell phones. Even if you receive a call, don't accept it and don't have a conversation while the session is on. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you for waking up in time to come for this. I'm particularly delighted to be speaking to Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy today. Not just because she has a very impressive and courageous body of work, but because it's a very compassionate one. Very often, the reporting of cataclysmic historical events is with the surface nature of those events, the surface facts, the figures, the large political reasons why they unfold. And too little attention is given to the psychological and emotional and social fallouts of that. Very often we look at the people on whose backs history is played out as collateral damage or the inevitable debris of the march of history. And we forget to look at what is really happening to them and fail to understand that they themselves are in turn the forces of history, and everything that they're experiencing will further erupt into new fault lines and new forces to contend with. Sharmeen, as many of you know, has won the Oscar for one of her documentaries called Saving Face, which tracks the stories of two women whose faces are completely disfigured by acid attacks, and of how that plays out. It's a particularly important story, and in continuum with what has been happening in India, the kind of outrage that people have been expressing against gender crimes and sexual crimes, and of why it is so endemic and deep-rooted in our societies. Insofar as very often the assailants and the perpetrators don't even see it as crime, and that's one of the things that I'd really like to talk to Sharmeen about. But apart from that, the other films that she's done, and in fact won an Emmy for a film on the terror children, which tracks the stories of 8 children who are forced out of Afghanistan to take shelter in Karachi as orphans. She's looked at women in Saudi Arabia, women in Afghanistan, looked at illegal immigrants in South Africa, looked at the fate of transgenders in Pakistan. And so many fragile communities that are seen to be unimportant in the big play of history, but actually are crucial pieces in it. So thanks, Sharmeen. Sharmeen, to begin with, let's start with Saving Face, because that's the glorious feather in your cap, and we'll go deeper into your work after that. Just for those unfamiliar with your work, how did you chance upon these stories? Why did it catch your attention? And if you can very briefly let them know the stories of these two women, so that we can resonate with our discussion.
Absolutely. Saving Face was born out of an idea that my co-director Daniel Yangi had. He was listening to BBC radio one day and heard Dr. Mohammed Jawad, a Pakistani British doctor, being hailed as Katie Piper's hero. Katie Piper was a British model who had had acid thrown on her face on the streets of London by her ex-boyfriend. And she had been rehabilitated by a plastic surgeon who was of Pakistani descent. And when Daniel heard that, he picked up the phone and called Dr. Jawad to find out whether Dr. Jawad knew about the phenomena of acid attacks in South Asia. And Dr. Jawad said, know about it. I come to Pakistan several times a year, and I work and do surgery for free for many of these women. Daniel contacted me soon afterwards and wanted me to work with him and partner with him on a project that profiled the lives of the women. At that time, we didn't know where the film would take us, because our main interest was profiling the work of a doctor working with some of the women in Pakistan on this. Of course, during the course of the filming, we began to learn of a great movement in Pakistan to get acid violence passed, a legislation passed in Parliament, which did pass during the course of the filming and made acid crimes punishable by life imprisonment and a hefty fine. Not only that, we met lawyers and other doctors who were working on criminal cases against some of the perpetrators and working to set up medical camps where these women were rehabilitated. But in essence, Saving Face is a story of two women who take completely different paths. Zakia, a woman whose husband throws acid on her face because she wanted a divorce, fights the system and ends up sending her husband to jail. And Ruxana, who becomes a victim of the system and has to go back and live with the man who threw acid on her face. Not only that, she has to go live with the man and become pregnant with another child during the course of the filming. So it shows that what empowered women, if they use the law, if they have the family support, can fight on to achieve, and what happens when women feel powerless and have to go back to the perpetrators.
Sharmeen, did you get to understand just what Ruxana felt? Did she actually make peace with it, or did she feel it to be a kind of violation of her? Did she share that violation with you in the film? And how did that process of going back to the man who had disfigured her so terribly play itself out?
The social structures in our societies for women who have been abused or battered is very weak. We are a very family-oriented society, and most often when women are abused, they turn to family, and when the family support isn't there, for example, in Ruxana's case, her parents were so poor, they couldn't take her back. That she resigned to the fact that she had to go and live with her husband again. But it's affected her very much so. She's very mentally unstable, unfortunately. And she became pregnant in the process. Her husband threatened to get married again. So a number of things played out, but extremely mentally unstable.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last day of the DSC Jaipur Literature Festival. You're here at the Councillage Darbar Hall, and we have a first session today, Saving Face, with Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy, who's in conversation with Shoma Chaudhury. I request everyone to make sure that there's no flash photography while the session's going on, and please switch off your cell phones. Even if you receive a call, don't accept it and don't have a conversation while the session is on. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you for waking up in time to come for this. I'm particularly delighted to be speaking to Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy today. Not just because she has a very impressive and courageous body of work, but because it's a very compassionate one. Very often, the reporting of cataclysmic historical events is with the surface nature of those events, the surface facts, the figures, the large political reasons why they unfold. And too little attention is given to the psychological and emotional and social fallouts of that. Very often we look at the people on whose backs history is played out as collateral damage or the inevitable debris of the march of history. And we forget to look at what is really happening to them and fail to understand that they themselves are in turn the forces of history, and everything that they're experiencing will further erupt into new fault lines and new forces to contend with. Sharmeen, as many of you know, has won the Oscar for one of her documentaries called Saving Face, which tracks the stories of two women whose faces are completely disfigured by acid attacks, and of how that plays out. It's a particularly important story, and in continuum with what has been happening in India, the kind of outrage that people have been expressing against gender crimes and sexual crimes, and of why it is so endemic and deep-rooted in our societies. Insofar as very often the assailants and the perpetrators don't even see it as crime, and that's one of the things that I'd really like to talk to Sharmeen about. But apart from that, the other films that she's done, and in fact won an Emmy for a film on the terror children, which tracks the stories of 8 children who are forced out of Afghanistan to take shelter in Karachi as orphans. She's looked at women in Saudi Arabia, women in Afghanistan, looked at illegal immigrants in South Africa, looked at the fate of transgenders in Pakistan, and so many fragile communities that are seen to be unimportant in the big play of history, but actually are crucial pieces in it. So thanks, Sharmeen. Sharmeen, to begin with, let's start with Saving Face, because that's the glorious feather in your cap, and we'll go deeper into your work after that. Just for those unfamiliar with your work, how did you chance upon these stories? Why did it catch your attention? And if you can very briefly let them know the stories of these two women so that we can resonate with our discussion.
Absolutely. Saving Face was born out of an idea that my co-director Daniel Yangi had. He was listening to BBC radio one day and heard Dr. Mohammed Jawad, a Pakistani British doctor, being hailed as Katie Piper's hero. Katie Piper was a British model who had had acid thrown on her face on the streets of London by her ex-boyfriend. And she had been rehabilitated by a plastic surgeon who was of Pakistani descent. And when Daniel heard that, he picked up the phone and called Dr. Jawad to find out whether Dr. Jawad knew about the phenomena of acid attacks in South Asia. And Dr. Jawad said, know about it. I come to Pakistan several times a year, and I work and do surgery for free for many of these women. Daniel contacted me soon afterwards and wanted me to work with him and partner with him on a project that profiled the lives of the women. At that time, we didn't know where the film would take us because our main interest was profiling the work of a doctor working with some of the women in Pakistan on this. Of course, during the course of the filming, we began to learn of a great movement in Pakistan to get acid violence passed, a legislation passed in Parliament, which did pass during the course of the filming and made acid crimes punishable by life imprisonment and a hefty fine. Not only that, we met lawyers and other doctors who were working on criminal cases against some of the perpetrators and working to set up medical camps where these women were rehabilitated. But in essence, Saving Face is a story of two women who take completely different paths. Zakia, a woman whose husband throws acid on her face because she wanted a divorce, fights the system and ends up sending her husband to jail. And Ruxana, who becomes a victim of the system and has to go back and live with the man who threw acid on her face. Not only that, she has to go live with the man and become pregnant with another child during the course of the filming. So it shows that what empowered women, if they use the law, if they have the family support, can fight on to achieve, and what happens when women feel powerless and have to go back to their perpetrators.
Sharmeen, did you get to understand just what Ruxana felt? Did she actually make peace with it, or did she feel it to be a kind of violation of her? Did she share that violation with you in the film? And how did that process of going back to the man who had disfigured her so terribly play itself out?
The social structures in our societies for women who have been abused or battered is very weak. We are a very family-oriented society, and most often when women are abused, they turn to family, or and when the family support isn't there, for example, in Ruxana's case, her parents were so poor they couldn't take her back, that she resigned to the fact that she had to go and live with her husband again. But it's affected her very much so. She's very mentally unstable, unfortunately. And she became pregnant in the process. Her husband threatened to get married again. So a number of things played out, but extremely mentally unstable.
Sharmeen, recently you know about the kind of protest there's been in India, a lot of introspection about why there's such prevalent gender crime. In your own work, even when you were looking at other aspects of women's life in Pakistan, what allows this kind of endemic sense that women are men's properties, that you can do what you want on their body? Does that have a religious underpinning? Is it really a lack of education, or does it cut across social strata?
I think it cuts across social strata, to be honest, and I think it has to do more with the fact that in our societies we don't punish enough men who basically perpetrate domestic violence or rape or acid violence. In our societies, we tend to look the other way. So if you look at villages or towns where you know of two men who have done something to a woman and not been sent to jail, it emboldens other men that this is not a crime. You know, that XYZ has done it, didn't go to jail, nothing really happened to that person. We have to change that mindset. You make enough examples of people and it'll become a deterrent. But when you don't make examples of people, it emboldens society to do this. And especially in our societies where sometimes it's our own families pressure us not to go out and report something because it brings dishonor to our own society. So you often find some rape victims won't even go and register the cases because A, they think the system is so ineffective, and B, our systems are made to make the woman feel somehow it was her fault that she got raped, or somehow it was her fault that she got beaten up. Like, it must have been something you did versus something he did. And that mindset has to change.
But did you find that women were supportive of each other in society, or was this attitude as prevalent amongst women as men?
I think that the more literate you are, the more support a woman will get. I think sometimes you see women-on-women violence in our societies as well. Mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws, I mean, it's enormous. Stove burnings, in the case of my film, Saving Face, Ruxana's mother-in-law and sister-in-law were complicit in her having acid thrown on her face. So, that kind of level of violence you find much more awareness comes when you are more literate. But I do find more and more, and even in villages and towns, that women are beginning to support other women. It's going to take a long time. If a woman's been a victim of domestic violence, she just thinks it's the rite of passage many of the times. And that has to change. Awareness, I think, is very, very important. How often do we go and tell women about their rights? Laws exist in constitutions and they're enshrined in, but if nobody knows about them, nobody's aware of what they can do and how much the system can protect them or help them, there's no good having laws that can't be implemented.
But what about the men? Did you speak to the husbands in the film, and were they open sharing the motivations of why they did that? In an interview you spoke of how there wasn't even an acknowledgement or an understanding that what they had done was wrong. Can you talk about that experience of talking to the men?
Ruxana's husband, who I traveled to her village to speak with him, said to me, straight in my eyes, said 99% of women in a burns ward are there because they've self-inflicted this upon themselves, meaning that they asked for it, or they've poured acid on themselves, or they've poured kerosene on themselves and burnt themselves. This is what his mindset was. And to be honest, at that time I was extremely angry about listening to this, and I wanted to shake him, but the more I thought about it, the more I said, well, this is the only life he's ever known. This is his only reality. He's not educated, nobody's ever told him that this is not the case, and he has no awareness. So really his mindset is a product of the society he's been living in.
The other big controversy that happened in India barely 2 weeks ago was that when, and in the aftermath of such outrage over the rapes, there were several social elders. There was a religious head called, well, not religious, he's a kind of spiritual head called Baba Asaram Bapu, Mohan Bhagwat, who was the head of the RSS. Many of them spoke about how, in muted ways, that women ask for this, or that it's that they're stepping out of cultural lines, which is why it happens. So what I'd be interested in knowing was that how would typically a local madrasa or clerics around the society react to a hate crime like this?
In Pakistan, unfortunately, you don't have religious leaders who would ever go out and say anything in favor of a woman who has been raped. So you would never find somebody saying this is completely wrong and it should not happen. In fact, they don't even factor into the debate. So it's not like they take sides or they say, a woman asked for it or anything like that. I've never heard them enter into conversation about something like this. But I take great, I think the objectification of a woman in society is something that all of us in society need to think about. Because I was on BBC the other day with Nandita Das talking to Vishal Hussain about the role Bollywood plays in objectifying women. The responsibility of cinema and how we put women forward and the roles that we allow women. For example, in films, if you have a woman who's being chased and harassed and harassed and harassed, and in the end she capitulates to the man and falls in love, what is the kind of, again and again and again, through many, many, many films, what is the message that we are sending out to a population that is becoming modern? Yeah, but also, you know, we live in societies which are still fairly conservative. Okay, I don't believe in censorship, but I do believe in at least having, if 90% of the women in our films are just meant to be objectified and wear sexy clothes and be out there and not be the strong lawyer or the doctor or the policewoman, and have the roles in which she is looked upon as the strong woman because she's strong, not because she's sexy or beautiful or she's taken her clothes off. I think that that is really, really important, and I think that cinema has to play a big role in that.
Yeah, I totally agree, because I'm fine with, you know, even presenting women because it's of their own volition. Absolutely. So they're claiming their own bodies. They can bear their bodies as they want. What I find really depressing about Hindi cinema is that all the women, even after they're bearing their bodies, are so submissive, you know, to every other aspect of their lives, and they're not questioning, they're not independent, and as you said, that you don't seem to step out of any other circle except the right to bear their bodies, you know, and I think that submissiveness is what is so terrible about the messaging in Indian cinema. But just to move away from saving face, Sharmeen, when you spoke to women across Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, in Pakistan, do you see any kind of new awareness afoot, a kind of political awareness? You know, several times one has spoken to political leaders out of Afghanistan, women leaders, Fawzia Kufi, and others, you know, who say that under the radar of international attention, women are actually claiming their spaces in these societies. Did you get a sense of that?
You know, in Afghanistan, traveling through the country, what I realized is that there are small pockets of women that are really against all odds, trying to strengthen their voice, trying to strengthen civil society. The tragedy of Afghanistan is going to be 2013 and 2014 when the United States pulls out, because with that pulling out will leave, you know, no fallback for many of these women. You know, it's taken them 10 odd years to even begin to have women in workplaces. You know, having women in parliament is very cosmetic, but to have women in workplaces, to have women in positions where they can make decisions is very, very important. Slowly you will begin to find in some provinces in Afghanistan that was beginning to happen. But speaking to women, I fear that they're going to be taking 10 steps backwards. Because now people are saying we need to talk about security. Women's issues are going to be secondary, if not a third thing. You know, and I've had trouble with that, because security and women's issues are very intrinsically related. Where you find that there's lawlessness, women are the first kind of victims, where they're attacked, where they'll be told to stay at home. And it's very easy for that to happen.
Yeah, but you know, the sense that the spaces for women opened up, is that a direct fallout of American presence in Afghanistan, and how does that work? And how do women then perceive the fact that so many civilians have died in American attacks? How do they reconcile these two things?
I don't think change can ever be imposed from the outside, but I do believe, and many of those women would have never been able to come out and even begin working had that environment not been created. There have been, the Americans have made way too many mistakes in Afghanistan for that to happen. In 2007, when I did Lifting the Veil, the most common thing I heard from women was that we were not given what we were promised. That when the invasion took place, there was a, you know, both Shelley Blair as well as President Bush had gone on and said that one of the reasons we're going into Afghanistan is to liberate its women. There's that famous address that was given. That didn't happen. And what is liberating a woman? You know, how do you liberate a woman that's gone through 2 decades of war? And is your liberation the same liberation as the woman, is what the woman wants? But having said that, the environment was conducive in at least some of the major cities for women to go out, go back to school, go back to work. But I feel the last 10 years has failed them miserably. And in many cases, some women have stopped taking the risks because women were being targeted, were being singled out, and many women have been assassinated.
You know, for the other interesting thing is that, of course, everyone interprets the status of women in Islamic countries to be a byproduct, an inevitable byproduct of the way Islam is being integrated across these societies. So when even these little boundary shifts are happening, how is it kind of happening within the religious framework? How are they pushing back on it? Are women themselves questioning the kind of religious tenets they've been brought up with? Or is it just happening in ways which excludes discussion on religion altogether?
Look, Islam has been hijacked massively around the world. I fail to understand why when our clerics talk about Islam, the first thing they think about is women, because that, you know, it's a religion, it's a way of life. It just doesn't focus on women. And one of the things that, of course, is easy to do is to prey on a woman. In any society, you prey on the weaker sex. In Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, in many of these Muslim countries, you find that somehow the men obviously think shame and honor rests with them, and they must protect the women. And my conversation always with them is we are very capable of protecting ourselves. We don't need you to protect us. And I think that you have now women who are coming out slowly in at least in Pakistan, I see, in towns. For example, I just finished a film with a young woman who lives in a very conservative area of Pakistan, right on the border with Balochistan and Sindh. And she didn't go to school. The people in her area didn't think that women should get educated at all. And she has used religion, and she has used her students to go door to door and talk to the men to convince them that this is something that is not only their religious duty, but it's something that is their duty to society to send women to school. So you find that in pockets, women are coming out and trying to do that. There's another young woman who I'm very, very impressed with recently, who is using religion to counter honor killings in Pakistan. You know, so you have people who, especially women, who now believe that they must use religion and they must use our own society to try and come up with some of the arguments against making women virtual prisoners.
Just one more question about women before I come to the other really vulnerable community that you've been looking at, which is children. But in Saudi Arabia, Mona Al-Tawi once put it very succinctly, and she said, if you're a woman in Saudi Arabia, you will either become a feminist or you'll be suicidal, you know. And again, just to understand, how does an entire society of women not fight against the extremely restrictive space in which they are allowed to live? So what was your findings in Saudi Arabia? Can you share some of the stories of the women and how they lived?
Well, I have to say I almost became suicidal living there, because it's bizarre to have to go out to even get a SIM for a phone requires a man. You know, I remember trying to check into a hotel in Al-Khubar with my fellow filmmaker, and we were told that we needed a character of good certificate from the local police in order to check in as two women in a hotel. And I just couldn't believe that a German general manager was asking me to get a character of good certificate from the local police in order to check in, but those are the rules that kingdom operates under. What I did find, and I have to say that some of the women I spoke to were the biggest stumbling blocks for women to move forward. So I remember speaking to an accomplished nurse in one of the hospitals in Jeddah who told me that you know, this is all being done to protect us. That we must allow all of these restrictions to be there, otherwise we will become vulnerable. And I kept asking her, how will you become vulnerable? And she said, well, the state knows best about how to take care of us. And I don't think that women should be allowed to drive, and I don't think women should be allowed to vote. And her argument, and I'll never forget this, is because women are weak because we have a menstrual cycle. And the menstrual cycle makes us, at that time of the month, for the 7 or 8 days of the month, we can't think straight. So how can we be allowed to be in positions of driving a car, or positions of authority, or positions of thing, when we ourselves can't take care of ourselves? And really, I have to tell you that was, for me, the lowest point in my life, hearing a woman say that to another woman. I tried to rationalize with her, but there was no rationalization. She was convinced that having our periods was making us weak. Another woman I spoke to who said that, who was actually working for a newspaper, fantastic middle-class woman, and her arguments are very legitimate in why women should get rights. And she said, I can't afford to have a driver. How do I get back and forth from work? Why should I trust a man to drive me who I don't know in the middle of the night somewhere? Public transportation is dismal in the kingdom. How can they just assume that everybody must be able to afford a car and a driver? Not only that, she said, I travel for business. I need a written permission from my grandfather, because my father doesn't live here, who's 87 years old, in order to travel each time. What if something was to happen to him? She told me the story about her grandmother who was 88 years old, and she was at the airport, and they didn't let her travel because she said that she needed a male guardian. And she said that my 88-year-old grandmother does not need a male guardian. What is she going to go out and do? But you know, these are ridiculous rules that exist in that society. What gives me hope about Saudi Arabia is that more women are graduating from college than men are, and ever before. Women are, you know, slowly, the Shura Council, women are being inducted. So, you know, change will never happen overnight in the kingdom for many, many reasons. But primarily, to be honest, is because the royal family is very scared of implementing these so-called radical steps that are seen by the outside world, because the population is fairly radicalized over there, and they're radicalized against the royal family as well. So I actually feel for the royal family in many ways, because they do want to become progressive. I do not agree with their system of governance or any of that, but they do want to. There is the intent. But they say if we do something, the backlash will be enormous. We need to make sure that we take steps that
don't get noticed.
Absolutely.
You know, you've been saying that when you get educated, that you've been finding a kind of shift in thinking. Has that been true across all your films? Because very often what I find very depressing is that no matter how educated one is, you know, that prison in the mind doesn't shift at all, even for women. You know, I'm not even going in talking about how men react, but that it's very much eventually a product of individual temperament, individual exposure, but it's not as if the education that is being imparted in any of our societies naturally leads to a kind of emancipation. And very often you might find that there are more stories of resistance on the ground, of women on the ground, just out of survival, rather than any kind of educated enlightenment.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, my husband often gets told by very educated people that we grew up with, that how do you allow your wife to do the work she does? And I find it very interesting that the word allow is used in that conversation, because I don't need permission to do what I do. But sometimes you find some of the most educated and enlightened minds are the ones who are the most closed in their outlook of life. And I do believe it is individual temperament, and it is individualism that forces somebody to think a particular way. Education, we hope, would open up people's minds, but I think it has to do a lot with awareness as well. It has to do with being part of a society that allows you to begin to open those kind of closed doors that you have in your mind. But yeah, I found some of the supposedly most educated people to have some of the closest minds.
And I guess just an interesting observation is that America, in many ways, which is seen to be the bastion of the free world, is in many ways extremely restrictive of women as well, you know, and there is a kind of subterranean violence against women all the time in their society. So, in a way, it's a kind of continuing engagement, and the fact that America supports Saudi Arabia the way it does unqualifiedly is a whole other discussion. But just moving to the children, Sharmeen, that you have filmed, what has been the impact of these years of war on the children? What was the most disturbing stories that you came upon? What is the most disturbing phenomenon that is happening unnoticed or unreported enough that you came across?
Well, I've reported on children and war in Iraq, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, and I think the common themes are forever scarred, to be honest, completely scarred. But you know, war has a way of affecting you, especially children, in two ways. Either you become very violent, you become very passive. And in Iraq, for example, the children that I profiled and I worked with, who basically at night when they go to sleep, they only hear the sounds of gunfire, bombs. When they draw, we were part of a Medicine Sans Frontières program, and every child was asked to draw anything. And 90% of the times they drew death and destruction. When 8, 9, 10, 12-year-olds are drawing that, how will they overcome that trauma? Especially because our societies, again, don't have psychological help. We don't believe in speaking about our issues or going to children and asking them, how do you feel? Or, you know, let's work on therapy, let's get you to overcome some of this stuff. We don't do that. In Pakistan, Pakistan is even worse because we're such a schizophrenic country that in one part of the country, people have not experienced war at all. In other parts of the country, it's active warfare. So we have a generation that's growing up that's completely disconnected from war. I mean, if you live in the tribal areas, Peshawar, Swat, you see bomb blasts every single day. If you live in Islamabad, Pindi, Lahore, you hear about it in the news, but it's not like you're going to walk out of your house and you're going to see a bomb blast happening. Chances are limited. And so you have children. I was in Swat recently at an orphanage, which is an orphanage for children who have been victims of the war. And beautiful young girls talking about their fears and their hopes. And every time they spoke about their hopes, they said, well, this can only happen when the war ends, or if the war ends. And so, you know, they still believe that this is going to be something that's going to affect them for a long period of time.
Did you come across children that are in the process of indoctrination by, you know, religious extremists or by militants? And what is that process of psychological, you know, allegiance that is created in them? How does it happen? How do they express that belief that, you know, killing is the only way forward?
You know, I always was surprised by the way the West and the rest of the world looks at suicide bombers, especially coming from who are, you know, suicide bombers under the age of 16. We often speak about the violence that affects people and how they become violent, and I wanted to really think about how does a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy strap a bomb to his body and go out and blow himself up? Like, what is it that propels him to do it? And so when we were making Children of the Taliban, I spent a lot of time with some of these children to understand, and their recruiters, to be honest, because it's the recruiter's mindset that gets transferred down to the child. And I have to say that they are very, very good at brainwashing these children, and there are specific steps that they take in order to do that. One, they isolate the parent from the child, so the child has no one that he can go to with questions. The people around him, his handlers, are the only one he can go to. Secondly, not allowed to watch television, listen to radio, anything that gives an alternative discourse. Third, read the Quran in Arabic, a language they do not understand because we are Urdu-speaking or Pashto-speaking populations. The person who's teaching you the Arabic can then tell you anything that he believes is in the Quran, and the child has no way of saying that. Being fed a steady diet of hate is very, very common. And also they are made to live in the most dismal of circumstances. Bread and water, basic, is the nourishment they get. When you live this kind of life and you're told that when you do this you will attain, you will get to go to heaven where there'll be milk and honey, where you'll get, you know, lots of food, where you will actually go to paradise because you're serving God. And when you're heavily drugged, because these children are heavily drugged before they're sent out to blow themselves up, and the trigger is almost always not with them. So they're drugged, they're sent out to an area, somebody else pulls the trigger on them. So what are they? They're actually robots. They're not even human beings. So they're not doing anything. They've been just programmed to do this. This is not something that's coming out of what they're doing. And I think that's important to talk about as a society, because when you talk about violence and the effect of violence, when we talk about suicide bombing, we must also start to think about why the perpetrators, what is their mindset? You can only beat somebody by attacking the mindset, and the mindset is what a man told me. I was filming in a madrasa which is fairly radical in Karachi, and we had the interview, and during the course of the interview, the man said, "We don't send anyone, we never brainwash anyone, we just spread the message of peace." And at the end of the interview, my cameraman moves back. There's a famous scene in the film, and we had a code between us, and I just told him to continue just filming. And I said, "Yes, but you are winning the war." And he looked at me directly and had the most evil laugh I've ever heard, and said to me, "As long as there will be sacrificial lambs, we will win." And that's what he felt, and that's what they feel. These are sacrificial lambs for them.
Just one last question before we open it up. In the film Reinventing the Taliban, what explains the hold that the Taliban has over these areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan? What are the conditions that allows them to be that entrenched? And do you think at all can they ever be modified or changed? Is dialogue one way forward, which is the route that everyone's advocating now after all these years of war?
Well, the Taliban have a very simple kind of outlook in life, to be honest, and they want power and control. These are disillusioned young men. Many of them don't fight for religion, they just fight for the money that they're paid, because they have no other employment. In the areas that they operate are fairly lawless, so they are kings. In the tribal belt of Pakistan, they are kings in the areas that they operated. This week, the American government asked Pakistan to release hundreds of Afghan Taliban fighters that have been in our jails for years, because now the Taliban are on the negotiating table with the Americans and no longer the terrorist organization they were. And I have to ask myself the question, what is going to happen to these hundreds of Afghan fighters who are going back into Afghanistan and who have been tortured in our jails and have been arrested on the behest of the Americans? Aren't they going to turn the guns inwards onto Pakistan? I mean, when you release hundreds of disillusioned, hard-driven fighters back into the system without having a system that supports them, what are they going to do? They're obviously going to go back and start fighting again. So there are a lot of policies that are flawed. There are areas, there are conclaves that allow them to flourish, and they want power. And when they see that they're winning, and they will see the American withdrawal as a major win, that when they see themselves winning, they want more and more. And I always say, why Afghanistan when you can have Pakistan? Well, Pakistan is clearly the bigger prize for them. So obviously the work is cut out for Pakistan. The next few years are going to be extremely difficult for us as a country, to be honest, because you'll find that with the withdrawal in Afghanistan, there will be a serious fight for Pakistan, not only in the tribal areas but outside it. But one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that our civil society is finally waking up to the fact that this is a war that affects us. And for me that's a big step, because it's taken 10 years for civil society to even kind of have that voice. And finally people are coming out of their homes to protest in small numbers, but they have started doing it. This time with the Malala shooting, as well as with the Shia bombing in Quetta, when people came out on the streets, I was shocked to see people coming on the streets, because honestly, I've been in protests where there have been 20 people or 15 people, where like 1,000 people on Facebook have liked the protest and 15 people turned up, So, but now you are seeing, hundreds of people are coming out, and so as long as the society begins to acknowledge that there's something wrong, we are taking the first step towards accomplishing something, at least towards moving forward and trying to say, let's not make this happen in our country.
Sharmeen, I think, before we open it up to the audience, that a huge, important part of your work is that you're making these things visible, and that people are beginning to get windows into personal and emotional spaces that are normally completely shut off. and you're immune to, as you said, it's taken so long for people to realize that this war is going to affect everybody. And even the drone attacks, even the unmanned vehicles are going to have human impacts. Let's open this up to the audience.
Hi, there was a case in the past year of a tragic case of Pakistani acid attack victim who committed suicide in Italy, and her ex-husband, who was supposedly the attacker, he's very well from a very powerful family, cousin of Foreign Minister Hina Rabbani Kar. He was roaming free and complaining that the press was hounding him and that was bad influence on his teenage daughters and things like that. So has he been brought to justice, and why would a situation like that happen?
Unfortunately, he has not been brought to justice. But the case of Fakhra Yunus is very unique because she is one of the few women who had had acid thrown on their faces in a city. Okay, so most of the acid violence is concentrated in southern Punjab in Pakistan, in villages and towns, primarily because acid is widely available in those areas because it's used to clean cotton, but also because you find high levels of unemployment, low levels of literacy in those areas. The case of Mr. Kar, who had thrown acid on Fakhra Yunus, is extremely tragic, and we were hoping that when she committed suicide, a case would be filed against her. There was a lot of pressure by the media to make that happen, but unfortunately that did not happen. And sadly, we do live in a society which is very much controlled by feudal laws and very much controlled, and so you find that happening. I will just tell you that while the Fakhra Yunus case is interesting, just in the last 2 months, a young man was shot dead. Bullets were pumped into his body for a minor argument by the sons of 3 feudal lords. And the public outcry against that has been so enormous, that the man who shot this young man fled Pakistan. He was arrested in the UAE, brought back to Pakistan, and now faces trial. This is unprecedented, to be honest, in Pakistan. It shows that the power of social media and the press is finally beginning to take hold. Maybe, and I'm just a cynic, maybe he'll end up paying large amounts of blood money and getting away with it. But for me, the hope is that at least civil society rallied to get him arrested, to bring him back, and he is in jail.
Just that optics is a big thing,
yes.
big move forward. Yeah.
Today we had a quote from Taslima Nasri, very interesting. She says, "I fought for empowerment of women all my lives, and 3 empowered women have made my life hell." That's Hasina, Khalida and Mamta. And actually Mamta is on record of having fired Damayanti Sen, the Park Street rape case we had. And that she was fighting for this person and she was shifted. So my question is, when the empowered women are there in a position of power, why is it still happening?
Because I don't believe, at least in my country, there aren't enough empowered women, to be honest. What is an empowered woman? Women can go out and be very visible and can go out and speak, but if women are not in decision-making corridors, if women don't have, that's the real power. When you are in business and you can actually make decisions, or when you are in parliament, just because you occupy a seat, when you can actually form legislation, go out and have that passed or have that implemented, that's real power. Cosmetic power and real power, I think, are 2 different things. At least in Pakistan, the number of empowered women are few and far between, and the ones that are very empowered have their lives miserable. You have Asma Jahangir, who's a lawyer in Pakistan. Her life is a nightmare. There are other female journalists who are very aggressive and go out and speak, and they're harassed all the time. We are seen as feminists, who just want to become replicas of the West. And that's a difficult narrative to counter on a daily basis. So it's going to take a long time for women to have actual power, at least in Pakistan.
Why do you say Asma's life is a nightmare? Because of the kind of stereotyping?
The statements that she makes and the risks that she takes, there are very real threats to her life, as there are to so many other women. I mean, Sherry Rahman, Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, is very vocal, and she's just had a blasphemy case registered against her. You know, so there are very, very interesting and you know, ways to counter women in Pakistan, unfortunately. So blasphemy is one of them. So why would a Pakistan's ambassador to the United States have a blasphemy case registered against her? Oh, because she speaks out. You know, so there are ways to curb women, unfortunately.
Yeah, I have a question. I was just wondering, I find that most of these people who are absolutely radical or orthodox, you go and interview them or you film them for showing the opposite view, but they do come out and speak, or they let you picture or film them. Are they using it to again get the same forum of yours as a forum to present their own case? So how do you deal with that?
Everybody wants to tell their story, and we must always hear all sides of the story. And the only way to understand the mindset of the militants, the mindset of these people, is to put them on screen, is to go out and find out and follow their lives. It's important to understand, how would you defeat the enemy when you don't know who the enemy is or how the enemy thinks? These people do it because they believe very strongly that this is their way of life, and they believe very strongly in that message, and that's why they go out and give the interviews, and they use the media in that way to spread their message. When I'm making a film, I'm looking to interview them because their view is very important, because they're the ones who are going out recruiting children, they're the ones who are going out, you know, creating mayhem, bombing places. And without that mindset, without understanding that their psyche, how will we understand how this war is progressing?
And I guess one way just to add on to that is also that the filmmaker's eye, even when you're giving the voice, there is still a narrative within which they are being presented. So it's quite different from propaganda material.
Well, yes, and actually, to be honest, when you watch a film and you have somebody who's saying that, you know, these children are sacrificial lambs, I'm not saying it, they're saying it. What is the audience going to think when they watch something like that? You know, you get to really understand their psyche. I think it's important to understand the psyche of the terrorists, definitely.
There's a gentleman at the back, there, in the corner.
Salam.
Walaikum assalam.
My understanding of legal history, be it Judeo-Christian, Sharia, or any other society, is that the laws governing marriage evolve out of the contract laws of property. Only recently in the West has this changed, and I would love to hear both your views on how this mentality of possession could be transformed here in South Asia. Thank you.
It's interesting that when a woman and a man get married in Pakistan and they have a nikah, the man is supposed to pay a woman an amount of money which is called her haq meher, which is something that she gets, which is supposed to be her safety net in case something happens. But there is supposed to be a monetary transaction that takes place. In Afghanistan, of course, you buy a bride. You don't marry a bride, you buy a bride. There's a bride price that comes with it. The contract of marriage is supposed to be liberating in Islam, at least, because it allows you the right to inherit, it allows you the right to divorce, it allows you, it allows women to get custody of their children as long as they're not of what we call of age, you know. And so there are all of these inbuilt mechanisms for women put in. Now, what happens is when you go out and actually get married, most men strike out the part where it says you can get a divorce. So you sign the document, but they strike out the part where it says, because it's supposed to not be considered good omen to start your marriage off by having a divorce clause in your marriage. You know, and educated people do that, and I'm always alarmed by that, to be honest. But when the law gives you the provision, when religion gives you the provision, and man takes that away from you, that's the real problem.
To answer your question, from my perspective, I think that for democracies, you know, you have to move away from looking at, you know, the kind of religious basis or even cultural basis for how these kind of personal aspects of one's life is transacted, and really look only at the constitution to access those rights. And so for instance in India, the Hindu law was reformed at the time of independence, and today the constitution enshrines a kind of equality of genders. It has changed the Inheritance Act, the Hindu Inheritance Act, and today boys and girls are supposed to inherit property equally. It might take very long for it to seep into society, but I really believe that it's very important to have the correct legislations, the correct vocabulary of legislation, so that every individual who wants to fight their community or the cultural practice in which they're born can at least access that law or that piece of legislation and say it's my right. If that doesn't exist, then it's very difficult to push back on cultural practices. So I think in every democracy you have to enshrine the rights of the individual and privilege that over the rights of the community, family, every other form of social organization. Yeah, just one last question. I think we are running out of time. One there, one this lady.
Hello. My question is that, okay, we believe in equality we want women to get equal rights, but don't you think we should look towards equity and equality? And one more thing, you have made a very good movie regarding women and children, but you have only shown the negative side. Why don't you show that in Pakistan women are everywhere? They are in the Air Force, they are in the army, they are in banks, and nobody bars them from doing anything, anywhere. Nobody has put strings and put on them to do anything. And we should talk about those things as well. If a woman is stopped from doing something, that's a crime. But if she can't do anything, that's not a crime. And if
I think, although I'm not clear what you mean by equity versus equality. What does that mean?
That is like equity means opportunity should be given to everybody. Like across the board.
No, wait, let me start by saying this young man comes clearly from Pakistan, of course. So let me start by saying, yes, how did I know? Your line of questioning clearly shows you're Pakistani. Let me also start off by saying that you have obviously not watched Saving Face.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you know that it shows a negative side of Pakistan?
Only negative.
How do you know?
Because the white that are getting into the law negative.
Really? Did you not hear me talk about a parliament that passed legislation, a lawyer that fights the cases, and a doctor that sends them, gets them rehabilitated?
Ma'am, I am really proud of the fact that you are Pakistani.
You know, the biggest problem with our men is that they make presumptions. So before you make presumptions, watch the film, young man. Next question, please.
And just to add to that, I think it's a very, superficial narrative to focus, even in India. Very often I for instance think that the situation of women in India is god-awful. It's abysmal and it needs to change overnight. And yet when you try to say this, very often people put forward the half percentage of women who have broken through the glass ceiling. That should be the norm. It's not something you need to celebrate. So I don't think that you need to focus on the positive picture, because that should be the norm. It should be something that is unremarkable. There was a girl.
This is more about your work than the society, but I wanted to ask you, how do you gain access to such regions like the Taliban and where children are being brainwashed? Like, how do you do it? Like, how do you go there?
I have a very good team of people that works with me. Actually, Fazila, who's sitting here, works with me as well. And I have some fantastic producers and fixers on the ground who I gain trust through and get access through. It takes us about a year to 2 years to make a film. So we first go out, meet the people, gain their trust, and then it takes us X amount of time to then go out and film them, and we follow them over a period of time. You're only as good as your last film as much as you are in the amount of time that you spend with people, because they have to trust you. And without trust, they will never allow you into their homes, they will never allow you into their inner sanctum. And so building trust takes months sometimes. And so the one thing I've learned as a filmmaker is, that you need to think exactly like the people that you spend time with, and B, find something in common with them. Because when you spend a year and a half with them, you need to be able to, you're part of their life. Exactly. Thank you.
Just before I close this, one question from the moderator again, which is that are any of your films shown on Pakistan TV? Has it had any kind of visible impacts? You know, I know that there will be many subterranean impacts, but are there any visible impacts? Has enough of an audience got to see them?
I just finished producing a series of 6 documentary films that were part of a campaign called Ho Yaqeen, which is belief in yourself. And the 6 films looked at 6 different issues confronting Pakistan. So women's education, drug addiction, rebuilding of a society after a major catastrophe, health, water, but the films each had one person who was tackling those issues. And the films were shown on 16 television channels at the same time. They ran for 6 months, and we are now in production for season 2. This is the first time that this has happened in Pakistan, where documentary films have been granted that we were actually taken up by Coca-Cola. They sponsored the series. But the fact that we were able to get such dramatic material on television, on primetime television, shows that there is an appetite, and hopefully it will begin society to have the difficult conversations we need to have in order to move forward.
Thanks, Sharmeen. You know, a huge part of one's work as a journalist or a filmmaker, any creative person, is to make things visible. You know, it's not often that you have the solutions for them, but the first step and the most crucial step is to make it visible so that one can begin to engage with it. I think Sharmeen's doing a huge role in making things visible in her societies and societies across the world, and for that we are grateful. Thanks everybody for being here.